Okay, welcome everyone to the first keynote address of the Undergraduate Research Symposium. Today it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Graeme Robertson, who is a professor of political science and director of the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies at the University of North Carolina. Dr. Robertson is the author with Samuel A. Green of Putin versus the People, and another book, Revolution and Reform in Ukraine, she authored with Sylvia Nitsova and Grigora Popalesh, and The Politics of Protest in Hybrid Regimes, Managing Dissent in Post-Communist Russia. He currently serves as the Associate Editor for Comparative Politics for the American Journal of Political Science. And today we'll be talking about his work, which focuses on political protest and regime support in authoritarian regimes. With that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Robertson. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Trevor. Thank you for that kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning. It would be nice to be in person, but it's nice to meet all of you anyway. And it's a real honor to be invited to talk with you guys. So what I was thinking of doing was talking a little bit about my background in terms of research and how I got into it and how I got from being an undergraduate to being an active researcher in this field. Talk a little bit about exactly how I think about the field and what the field is, what it means to be a political scientist in the contemporary world, and what the big issues I think are that I try to address, and many of the big issues that I don't address, that I just simply can't. And then get into with that background, get into a more general conversation with you guys about what your concerns are and what you want to talk about and what's interesting. We can talk about nuts and bolts of careers, or we can talk about nuts and bolts of Russian politics too, or pretty much any other topic that you guys have on your minds. One of the things that I think is important to underline in a context like this and to think about is when you're thinking about research. This is a research symposium. When you're thinking about research and the work that you can do, there are a number of different ways to come at this issue about what it is you should be working on and what it is you should be interested in. And I think there are the sort of scientific model that you get certainly in graduate school and possibly at the undergraduate level too, is very focused on what the existing literature is and what the existing problems in the literature is. What do we know about Russian politics? What do we not know about politics in Ukraine, for example, or and what are the challenges? And that's very important. But it's also very important as you develop a research agenda to be doing something that's authentically you, and something that you're actually genuinely really, really interested in and driven to work on and learn about. And for some people, that's really obvious what that is. Some people just have a passion for a particular kind of topic or a particular set of questions. And for others, that's not so obvious. And you have to think a little bit harder and find your passion. And one of the ways to find your passion, I think, is to look really into your own biography, into your own self, into your own experiences in life and in education, and think about what are the unique talents that you have, the unique energies that you have, the unique drives that you have, that could actually really contribute something new. And something authentic and dynamic to your academic work. And I think all the way through my career, I've had mentors tell me that at various stages, and I've tried to follow that advice. And the result of it has been, at least for me personally, that even after I've been doing this for, I don't know at this point, getting on for 30 years plus. It's still extremely exciting and exhilarating, and every day I want to work, and what I mostly want in life, my professional life at least, is more time to work, and that's incredibly that's a gift, and something that I'm incredibly grateful for. And I'm grateful to these mentors for underlying the importance of finding something that's authentically you, and building on that. So that's sort of the overall message that I wanted to convey at the outset. What is authentically me? Well, what about the work that I do and the part of the world that I study? Well, it really goes back to the Cold War and growing up in the city of Glasgow in Scotland. Actually just outside Glasgow, and right next to a US nuclear submarine base on the River Clyde, and the submarine base called Faslane, where both British nuclear submarines docked and American nuclear submarines docked. And so growing up with a sense of an understanding of being, in this small town outside in this small country, floating in the middle of the North Atlantic, but nonetheless feeling at the center of global politics, nonetheless feeling that, when the inevitable nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union happened, we'd be on the target list. We'd be near the top of the target list, and therefore, we'd go up in smoke very rapidly. But at least we'd have some significance. And so since that early years in the 1980s, I always had this huge interest in the Soviet Union and in the United States, and in trying to understand why it was that they were going to cut all our lives and our civilization short. And so that got me to study communism and communist governments and communist economics at college. I started college at the University of Oxford in 1987, studying philosophy, politics, and economics, and very quickly specialized in the then communist countries, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe primarily. By the time I took my finals at the end of 1990, they were mostly not communist anymore, and the main country that I was studying was about to be gone entirely, the Soviet Union, and I was hooked. Right at that point, it was definitely the most incredibly exciting period of my intellectual life. Things were changing so fast. I was sitting in seminars with scholars who had devoted their whole life to studying communism and who were in tears, not because they lamented the death of communism, quite the contrary for the most part, but because they felt that they had acquired all this expertise and it was meaningless now, right? This was the worry. Of course, it wasn't meaningless. Of course, what they had learned and understood about these countries and learned the languages, learned culture, learned history. All of these things were incredibly important. Also understanding the communist system and how it worked and how it would break down and what the difference and how that would shape the future. These were all incredibly important and valuable pieces of knowledge, but it was this very exciting and dynamic time intellectually and in politics. And politics, it turns out, over the next 20 plus years, 30 plus years, sorry, in the region hasn't gotten any less interesting and exciting. I think, there was sort of an assumption amongst many people that things would rapidly, not return, because they weren't like this before for the most part, but turn in some sense towards being like Western Europe. And Western Europe at that time looked like a peaceful, happy continent. And unfortunately, expectations about all of these things were proved to be not very well founded. And we got the reemergence of ethnic politics. Very importantly, we got the reemergence of nationalism. We got the re-emergence of or divides between conservatives and liberals in the region, and then new issues too that came onto the agenda, like immigration and globalization, and now the pandemic. And so there's always unexpected things that come along and really shift the political agenda and the political debate and move what's really fascinating to be working on. So that's another thing to be alive to in thinking about your research, is not just what's a problem in the literature and not just what's authentically you, but also thinking about what's actually a problem in the world, right? There's one thing for something to be a problem that scholars care about and scholars work on, but I think it's always more, at least for me, it's always more engaging and more powerful if I think that what I'm working on actually matters to people outside of the academy, and if I can write, when I write a research proposal or a research project, if I can write that part of it that says why non-scholars, why politicians, why citizens ought to be concerned about this issue. And there's no shortage of these issues around. So that's sort of the kind of a motivational set of ideas around what one should work on. For me, concretely, what that meant was when I started working seriously on Russia in the mid 1990s. Most people, the problem in the world in the early 1990s had been how to create a market economy. And lots of people had done really interesting work on privatization, on property rights, on governance. But for me, what was really interesting was that this was the beginning of this, of a major social crisis, in which there was a lot of hidden unemployment, a lot of people, a massive increase in poverty, a collapse in the social system. And so what I was really interested in was sort of the second stage of this creation of capitalism. What was going to be the consequences for ordinary citizens of this transformation of their social system, and was this going to result in, for example, mass waves of protest? And so ultimately, that's what I wrote my dissertation about, and it became the book that Trevor mentioned, The Politics of Protest in Hybrid Regimes, which focuses on the evolution of protest politics in Russia under Yeltsin, and then the first part of the Putin administration. Embarking upon that specific research topic, I sort of developed another principle that that's guided my research subsequently, which is to remember that for all the specificities and historical particularities of Russia and Ukraine and Central Asia and different parts of Eastern Europe, nonetheless, the people that live there are people, and they're citizens of the world. And so when we think about politics in the region, we should think about theories of politics that apply more generally, and we should think about how they either do or do not apply in the region, and what's similar and what's different. In other words, try to maintain a kind of a scholarly distance from the particularities, I think is the way I would put it, and try and understand identify what's general first before assuming that everything is different. There's lots of things that are going to be different. So, for example, in my work on protest, what I found was that the regional governors, for example, in the Russian structure, played a very particular role in shaping protest patterns because of the way large enterprises were owned, and because of the way that the subsidies went from the central government to the regions. But the basic idea that one should understand political protest in terms of political struggles at the very top, not just on the streets, but at the very top level of politics, which is something that's true all over the world, was also true in Russia. And that sort of basic structure and framework became something that really guided my first book, and was something that really enabled me to I think make a real contribution that was valued both by scholars of Russia and protest in Russia, but also scholars in the West. And so thinking about that broader, you might think of it as a broader audience, you might think of it as a broader intellectual project, but situating your work in that broader context, I think, is something, at least for a social scientist like myself, has been really, really useful. I don't want to talk too long. I want to talk just a little bit about what happened after Politics of Protest, because Trevor mentioned the book Putin versus the People. Putin versus the People is a very different kind of a book that I published last year. It just came out last month in the Russian translation. I don't have a copy. No, it's called in Russian. It's called Kto здесь власть, because Putin versus the People is not a title that you can get published. In Russia, actually, it's not a title that either Sam or I wanted. It was a title the publisher came up with to sell books. But essentially, it's a study that focuses in part upon opposition on Russian society, and looking at a broader phenomena within the society, not focusing on events inside the Kremlin. In fact, it's very self-consciously intended as a book that's not about Putin really, but is more about the people and about sometimes we call it Russia's Putin rather than Putin's Russia, right? And trying to understand the phenomenon of Putin through the minds of Russian citizens more broadly rather than the other way around. And it's a book which looks at sources not just of opposition to President Putin, but also, so more importantly, really in the book, sources of support. And it again takes theories developed in primarily in Western contexts about political psychology, and using them as a tool, as a kind of first draft, if you like, as a set of instruments for trying to think about the psychology, the political psychology of authoritarian rules. What is it that leads people to support a government that's going to, cut their access to free information, that's going to, limit their rights to protest and expression, and that's going to curtail democracy more generally, and even without necessarily producing much in the way of economic benefits either. Right? How is it that a government like that is able to sustain itself, and what are the psychological and social forces that allow it to thrive, to continue to thrive after 10 years of economic stagnation? And there's a bunch of different threads in the book, but the essence of the argument really comes down to thinking about how the state is able to set the agenda by controlling television. It's able to mobilize wedge issues in society, very much in the way Western politicians try to mobilize wedge issues, but mobilize sentiment against foreigners, mobilize sentiment against LGBTQ people, mobilize sentiment, against atheists and non-believers. So sort of very classical issues that we've seen in Western politics all the time, but mobilizing them in the Russian context, in which the state has enormous control over the media and to a certain extent over the internet. And then looking at the kind of broader social reinforcement of that message through schools, through teachers, through industries, and the influence that has on sort of citizens who just want a quiet life, who don't really want to be involved in politics, and shaping their understanding of what's patriotic and not patriotic to do. And that creates this whole kind of social edifice around President Putin that makes his regime very resilient to economic shocks. But we argue in the book also very vulnerable in the sense that it really does rely on popular support and at least popular acquiescence. And that has to be fought for and campaigned and mobilized around on a regular basis, or it would threaten to go away. So that's the Putin versus the people. My next sort of set of projects have been around COVID and COVID's impact on Russia and Ukraine. It's very, very, very hard in the context of the last 18 months to ignore that issue. And if you're interested in political psychology, as I have become, if you're interested in the role of emotions in politics, which is also another part of the Putin sort of recipe, if you like, then it was hard to ignore COVID, and I've launched a whole series of projects with collaborators at Cornell and Princeton and King's College London around really the implications of COVID for support for the regime, but also how COVID interacts with emotions such as especially anxiety and worry, and that sort of set of issues. And so I have a whole series of projects that are going to come out in the next year, I hope, papers, and then eventually maybe a book about COVID and its impact in Russia and Ukraine. I just want to say one last thing. When they were doing the introduction, I overheard that your next session, Susan mentioned, is about environment. Very happy to talk about that too. That's one. It's a subject which I was about to turn my own research on when COVID hit, and COVID kind of swept it off my agenda and replaced everything in my life, really. But I think that's incredibly important. It's very, very underestimated, that its role Russia's role both in the whole global challenge of climate change, but also domestically in Russian politics. I think climate is really, really important. So and Central Asia too. I don't need to convince you guys of that, I'm sure. So that's something that I think is a really terrific and an important issue. I'll stop there. I could talk. I'm an academic. I could talk all day. But I'll stop there, and let's get into some questions and hear what you're actually interested in and want to hear about.
Thank you, Graeme, for that very interesting talk. There is a question already in the chat here from Julia Brock, and she wants to know if you could expound on the title of your book, being shifted by editor or publisher for popular appeal, or what title would you feel is more accurate?
Yeah, so title is what you learn, and then if you do journalism or write op-eds, you'll learn this very quickly too. That the writer does not control the title; that the press controls the title, or the publisher, the editor at the Washington Post or wherever it is controls the title. And their job is to come up with a title that's eye-catching and that's different, right? In a world in which you're competing with a lot of different voices for an audience, and what they're very skilled at is doing that. And so very early in the writing of this book, the press wanted a book that emphasized the vulnerability of the Putin regime, and they wanted a book which emphasized sort of Putin as being antithetical to the interests of ordinary Russians. Now, if you read the book, you'll find that the argument is almost exactly the opposite of that, right? The argument is partly about the durability of the regime, and it's about vulnerabilities and what the vulnerabilities look like in that context, for sure. And, makes the not highly original, but I think ultimately accurate prediction that change will happen. And it will be surprised when it does, so that's kind of the vulnerabilities part. But they really wanted this title, Putin versus the People, and they made that very obvious early on. Sam and I came up with, if I told you 30 different titles, I wouldn't be exaggerating. There was actually, at one point we had, it has to be something and something. They wanted a kind of parallelism. And so we had lists of 15 nouns and then another 15 nouns and adjectives, and moving them around and trying them in different combinations. What we really liked was Russia's Putin, right? So kind of like something that turned it around and said, it's not Putin versus the people, it's Putin and the people, or actually really it's the people and Putin. But really to the point of this is the contract we signed with this title on it. If you change the title, we're not going to do the contract anymore. And by that time, you've already written the book and you're wedged in. So that's just a word of warning. And I'll tell you, like, quite frankly, that it's been a little problematic because people are very guided by the title of a book, and a lot of the academic reviews we've got were mostly very positive. I have to say, we've been really thrilled with the reception. But people remain puzzled by the title, and that was a marketing exercise. We're thrilled that in the Russian version, obviously that was not going to be a title that flew with a Russian publisher, because they care about their business and their livelihood too. So they came up with what I think is a much better title. Those days Vlast, who's in charge here, right? Which I think is a really interesting and provocative title. It's also a chant at Russian protests that you hear very frequently at Navalny and other protests. So it has that nice kind of, it has a very specific meaning in the Russian context.
Yeah, this is really interesting. You look at American media, and the regime is always on the verge of collapse. And it's been that way for the past 20 plus years. So
that's what people want to read, right? And and it'll be true one day.
Inevitably. Right.
Yeah.
So Susan has a question about, do you have any advice for undergraduate researchers on publishing, on the process, anything from your experience?
Yeah, so right now I have a student who just finished their honors thesis, and they want to publish it, and it's really interesting. It's about support for for Russian mercenaries abroad, and the role of Russian mercenaries in Russian foreign policy. And so it's kind of a topic that you would think potentially has an audience. So the first thing is have a topic that potentially has an audience, which goes back to what I was thinking about in terms of things that you think people will find matter. But the first step in going from, say, a thesis or a term paper into a publication, if that's the sort of academic kind of route, is to identify an outlet that you want to publish in, and that you think might be interested in publishing the kinds of things that you're writing, and then go to that outlet and read a lot of what they've published and learn. Study the format, study the style, the length, obviously, but also how the arguments are constructed. Find something that looks as close to something you want to write as possible, and then imitate it. Write your piece in a way that models that format. That's sort of, I think, something I've in the past found really, really helpful. Nobody mentioned this to me in grad school, but even if you're writing your first academic article, go get the journal you want to publish in, and then and copy the style. That's the way to go. I mean, obviously you're not copying words or anything. It's not plagiarism. It's about learning structure. And then the second thing is to spend, and this applies even more if it's a journalistic piece, is to reach out to the editor that you want to work with first and float the idea. Less so with academic work, but very much so with journalists. They are interested in working with you on the piece. You pitch an idea. If they like the idea, then they'll be more than happy to work with you. You'll do a draft. And then what I found is you'll have to do a draft by tomorrow because it's super urgent. Do it now. Then they'll sit on it for weeks. And then they'll get it back to you and they'll have rewritten the whole thing. And they want it back again by tomorrow, right? And there's an enormous power imbalance, and you just have to put up with that. That's just the way it is. If you actually want to go through the process, it's worth it, believe me. So put your pride in a drawer and work with the editor and take very seriously what they say. They do usually know better about how to write things for their audience than you do. So be humble about it. But on content and ideas, you should make sure it's authentic and defend what you're trying to do and keep it real, right? But also be respectful of their better expertise in that area. I think sort of trying to combine those two things. So in other words, academic writing and journalistic writing are different. And the publishing processes are kind of different, but both of them begin with identifying the outlet that you want, and then reimagining your work as something that looks like something they published before.
Great, thanks. That's sound advice. So Thomas Swope asks, do you believe that Vladimir Putin seems to be more focused on centralized government or is trying to reduce the criminal organizations that corrupt the Russian government?
Right, so this is a great question. This is a very interesting set of topics. This is one of these questions that a little bit of history helps a lot with. And essentially, the history I would point to in this case is really the history of the late 1990s, when the Russian state was really in a state of collapse, and this was a state that had an enormous repressive apparatus, had lots of guys mostly guys with what Chuck Tilley called violent entrepreneurs, people with skills in violence and making things happen through violence. And they started to freelance. They left often either the military or the police agencies that could no longer afford to employ them, and they put themselves in the service of what was already a fairly considerable organized crime networks in Russia. And then gradually over the 2000s, what the Russian state did before Putin, but also under Putin, was to try and reorganize its control over organized crime, not to eliminate organized crime so much as to reassert the state's primacy over organized gangs. So the state reinforced what became the FSB in such a way that they could decide. They can't stop organized crime working, but they can decide who gets to work and who gets to operate, and they get their cut, right? And this is very much the work that Putin did in the mayor's office in St. Petersburg. That was really centrally one of his tasks, was dealing with local organized crime gangs and making sure that the mayor's office got its share, and that a certain amount of peace was kept in the streets, that the violence was narrowly targeted as possible. And so ever since, Putin has had this reputation as having these underworld connections. And so at one and the same time as centralization has very much been his major agenda and building up the Russian state, he's understood that there is a kind of symbiotic relationship between the Russian security apparatus and these organized crime groups, and that they can have a mutually profitable interaction. It's not a zero-sum game, right? It's not either it's the gangs or it's the state. No, the state gets to license, unofficially, obviously, the gangs, and gets to work through them sometimes against them, but definitely as that them as being a primary player in the game of security and economic development in all across Russia's regions. So it's a mixed picture, and it's one that's evolved over time.
So Dulek Tas asks, regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, in your opinion, how successful is Russia in implementing vaccine diplomacy as compared to the United States and China?
Right. So there's two issues here. One is the domestic vaccination program, right, and then the other which is Dilek's question, which is about vaccine diplomacy. So on the vaccine diplomacy front, the Russians have been very aggressive about vaccine diplomacy, much more than the US, which has been very inward-looking in terms of its vaccination programs, and has focused very heavily on making sure there's enough vaccine available to satisfy demand or to meet the enormous demand in the United States, and so hasn't been very big on sharing vaccines, hasn't been very big on donating vaccines. Now that situation, now that there's kind of a big drop off in demand domestically in the United States, the US has started to turn to vaccine diplomacy, providing vaccines to India, for example, last week, and some other places, but has been very slow, or at least uninterested in diplomacy. By contrast, the Russians have been very aggressive in providing vaccines to India, vaccines to Mexico, all across Latin America. And really using its access to vaccines as a relatively inexpensive and cheap tool of pushing its soft power, and of trying to convince the world that Russia remains a technologically advanced country, and one that represents, at least to some degree, an alternative to the United States and to China, right? China, has, as in so many things, does things similarly to Russia, but just way more, right? Has much bigger vaccine programs, has much more vaccine available, and has been, very assertive in its vaccine diplomacy. So these two countries really have taken quite a different approach than the United States. More, for various reasons, more interested in the external diplomacy aspects of the vaccination than on the domestic politics. The domestic politics of vaccination in Russia is really, really interesting in the sense that Russia came up with this vaccine in a very short amount of time, with a cavalier attitude towards making data available, and a cavalier attitude towards approval and all of the tests that usually go before approval is granted. They really fast-tracked it in a way that was different from the way that the vaccine was fast-tracked in the West. And I think that has generated quite a lot of skepticism domestically about vaccination. When the vaccines first became available, the uptake was much slower than it has been in other countries in the West. Early research suggested that people who trusted the state more were more likely to get vaccinated. So it's kind of, fortunately in Russia, that's kind of older people. And so, from a kind of epidemiological perspective, that's good. But from getting the vaccine out, the proportion of people that trust the state in Russia is low. And so that puts kind of a ceiling on the vaccination efforts. They then started pushing out the vaccines to universities, and in places of higher education. And that was really interesting because the task there was to try and convince a small number of this otherwise really skeptical community to get vaccinated, and then hope that when people started to see their friends and colleagues vaccinated and returning to their lives, then they would want to get vaccinated too. And that's worked reasonably well. There's been, amongst the kind of educated and better off classes in Russia, there has been reasonable uptake of the vaccine. And you see a lot of people, at least in the early stages, flying back from London and other parts of Western Europe to go to Moscow to get vaccinated if they were Russian citizens, if they had Russian citizenship, because of the success of the vaccine there. But we're now kind of in this point of where demand for the vaccine is really the low-hanging fruit has been picked, and Russia still has relatively low vaccination levels. And so the question is how to move on from here. I actually don't know the answer. We have a survey in the field right now. It started on Tuesday, looking at vaccination attitudes and with some experiments trying to understand in particular a question that I think is super interesting, which is, in Russia you have this weird situation where you have a government that's been essentially dealing in conspiracy theories and promoting conspiracy theories since 2012. So promoting lies about Western sponsorship of opposition movements, and then about the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner in Ukraine, about the nature of the revolution in Ukraine, and then about Western conspiracies against Russian athletes and the doping scandals and so on. So lots and lots of crazy conspiracies that have been featured very prominently front and center on Russian state media. And what we do know is that people who buy into conspiracies of one kind tend to buy into conspiracies more generally, right? If you're a kind of person for whom these lies make sense, then you're persuadable of a lot of things. So this government then has to turn around to its citizens and say, oh, and by the way, all these conspiracies you're hearing about the COVID vaccination, about how we cheated, about how it's a plot by Bill Gates to monitor your brain and all of this kind of stuff. Don't believe any of that stuff. That's all nonsense. Trust us on this one, right? Well, that's interesting. Do they get away with that? Who's convinced by this? Who's not convinced by it? I don't know the answer. I will in about 2 weeks. At least, well, not know the answer, but hopefully I have something interesting to say about that within a couple of weeks. So the politics of vaccination in Russia, I think, are really, really fascinating, and something that I hope to write about reasonably soon.
Thanks. Julia has another question. In light of scholars with firsthand Soviet exposure in the 80s and 90s, wondering about their careers changing, how do you envision future generations of scholars who do not have any firsthand experience with the USSR as a frame of reference? And how difficult will it be for them to understand the USSR decades after its fall?
Yeah, so this is fascinating. This is a really interesting question. So there was a really interesting phenomenon that happened with, this is like super inside baseball. It might be kind of, I don't know if it's interesting or not, but I find it interesting. There was a whole generation of scholars who graduated from, Columbia and Harvard and Princeton just after the collapse of the USSR, who wrote their dissertations, kind of in the 92, 93, 94, who got jobs at Princeton, Harvard, Columbia, and that way that they kind of rotate. And none of them got tenure, or very, very few of them got tenure, because they had been able to they came up with their dissertation in Soviet times. Then they did the research in the kind of immediate collapse. And then by the time they wrote their book up, the kind of the agenda had changed and was different. And sometimes the skills that they had learned, and sometimes just their interests, various things conspired against it, made it really hard for them to have a first project, then a second project that was really going to get them tenure at a first tier institution. My own advisor got fired in my fourth year at Columbia, where I did my PhD. And so, it was really tough. Things were changing so fast that it was hard for these people to adapt. The next tier of people who came up afterwards have been much more successful in hanging on to their jobs and getting tenure. Even although change is a constant, right? And understanding, that what you're working on now, is going to have to, evolve fairly rapidly, and you're going to have to be nimble. The other thing that happened in political science during this period is there's been a total revolution in the style of research and what people consider to be evidence, and what kind of research is considered good and what kind of research is considered bad. So my dissertation turned into an article in the American Political Science Review, the leading journal in the field. If I was to send it to them now, they would laugh at it for being antiquated. And that's only, that's 10 years ago. And so things change in all fields really, really rapidly. And so that's just a fact that all scholars you're going to have to deal with. So that's the sort of broader context. In the context of the USSR in particular, and really writing about it, I suppose, as a historian, and trying to understand it without firsthand experience, again, that's a problem historians face all the time, because you're not living in the past, and generally, the past is, whatever past you're writing about is sufficiently far in the past that there's not much firsthand direct experience. But I think the Soviet case is particularly interesting because it really was an alternative civilization, right? A very, very different way of understanding the world, a different way of making a living, right? A very different way of going to school, a very different way of even getting married and retiring, and all of the sort of experiences that people have in their lives were organized in a different way, and self-consciously so, in the Soviet Union. And I think that's really a super interesting challenge. And I work with contemporary stuff, so I don't deal with that challenge very much. But I think it really is it's a fascinating set of issues. And there are ways that with memoirs and whatnot of getting into that mindset. But that's hard. But even if you did have, I guess the consolation is that even if you did have firsthand experience, so Trevor's advisor and my colleague here at UNC, Don Raleigh, a historian, who spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s. Your experience as a student, as a foreign student, is different from your experience as a Soviet citizen. And most of Don's work really was, about periods before the time that he was actually able to spend time there. It was originally about the revolution, and then later about Soviet baby boomers. So again, that imaginative leap, that empathetic leap is still required, even if you did have experience there. So It's a very interesting question. I think is you know, the summary.
Thanks, Graeme. So I don't see any other questions, but you know, there are a couple of things that I would be interested in hearing you comment on, just to take advantage of your expertise and insight. I don't know if these are too obvious, but you know, what would you say about Russia's policy toward Ukraine? Is one thing, and how that's changing, and you know, particularly in light of the recent military buildup, and then they backed off. What's going on there? What's the agenda?
Mm-hmm.
And then also, you know, if time permits, what you make of the Alexei Navalny phenomenon, and you know, is there a real threat to Putin's regime in this opposition movement?
These are the two kind of like uber questions of our profession right now. So I'm glad you asked them. The strategy with Ukraine is really well. I think it's depressingly familiar. Let me put it that way. I think what Russia's goal in Ukraine is, you know, it's evolved over time, and I think initially when the revolution happened in Ukraine, they were blown away by their success in annexing Crimea and how easy that was. I think they were shocked by how easy it was, and that encouraged them to try further afield. And I think at the beginning of the revolutions and the uprisings in eastern Ukraine, which, you know, there's lots of debate about this, but there's definitely there was a very significant, I think research shows this, local aspect to this. So this was not just a Russian imposed revolt. There were strong local elements from local elites. And the Russians, when they saw this, were very excited about it. They rushed to help very quickly, you know, in their way. Though they didn't really send much in the way of military reinforcements until such time as the Ukrainian government was pushing back very hard. The Ukrainian military got its act together later in the summer of 2014. It was at that point that the Russians very quickly understood the limits to their ability to control events in Ukraine. I think they were disappointed that it was only, you know, parts of Donetsk and Lugansk that they were able to, you know, where indigenous revolutions took place and where they were able to make them stick. I think they were hoping that there would be real uprisings elsewhere. This did not happen. It didn't happen in Kharkiv. It didn't happen in Mariupol or Odessa, which were places that were definitely, I think, on their wish list, if you like, earlier in that year of 2014. And so they quickly backed off to trying to solidify their holdings in eastern Ukraine. They definitely moved in much bigger numbers and really upped the military support to the rebels. And it really then became a much more Russian-controlled war. They murdered a bunch of local commanders, and there was lots of infighting on that side. And I think the goal then became to preserve the status quo. It became a kind of, you know, I wouldn't call it a defensive war, because you can't fight a defensive war in someone else's territory, I don't think. But they were trying to defend the gains that they had made. And they're also interested, I think, you know, there's been talk backwards and forwards about whether, you know, the Crimean solution of declaring not just independence, but applying for membership of the Russian Federation and being accepted into the Russian Federation, that was a model that they were going to follow in Donetsk and Lugansk. And I think that's off the table for now. It's always something they can bring up. They continue issuing passports to people in the region, so that they can claim they're Russian citizens. So that's always a card that they want to that's there if they want to play it. But I think primarily now it's a matter of trying to prevent Ukraine from integrating into the Western alliance system. I think that the military buildup that we saw in the last few months was more of a signal to the Biden administration that we could really break this thing and mess things up really badly if we wanted to. but I don't think it was a real sense that they were actually going to invade in significant numbers. Now, the other thing I would say is that before the annexation of Crimea, I also said that I didn't think that was going to happen, right? So, in interest of candor, I'm an analyst from here. I'm not sitting inside Putin's brain, and thank God. And so, people's assessments can be wrong about these things, and I always like to I like to own my mistakes. So you should bear that in mind when you think about what I've said. But I think I think the Russians understand that there are real military limits to what they would get away with in eastern Ukraine, and what they really want to do is stop Ukraine joining the West, and that's really the strategy, I think. On Navalny, that's a really interesting set of issues. I think what Navalny has done over the years is build this really extraordinary campaigning machine that represents, if allowed to compete in elections, would represent a very major electoral force in Russia, possibly to become the second largest political force in the country, and would be a dramatic game changer, right? Which is why they don't let them participate in elections, and why they have really upped their level of persecution of Navalny's team and Navalny supporters throughout the country. There's draft laws in the Duma banning you from running for office if you've ever made a donation to Navalny's anti-corruption foundation, or if you've ever participated in any of their events online, these kinds of things. So they're really cracking down hard because it is a real threat. Now, when we use the term Navalny and Navalny protests, people push back on that, and they say, well, people participate in this opposition movement and protests who don't like Navalny very much. People talk about a coalition of the dissatisfied or of the disgruntled, people who are upset or annoyed about various different things, who are not necessarily Navalny supporters, attach themselves to these events and these protests as kind of focal points for expressing discontent and anger. That's definitely true for sure. None of it would exist without Navalny and without the extraordinary courage that he displayed in going back to Russia. Something that I think none of us really expected to see happen. Again, there's no predicting individual behavior on a certain level, but the risks and the sacrifices that he's made, I think, have really transformed him from being a figure of a fairly narrow, of a sizable but narrow constituency, to being someone who's potentially, really has a much broader reach. And that's why we won't see or hear from him very much, I think, for many years. Sad to say, I think, the regime is going to do everything in its power to bury him, literally, probably, if not only metaphorically, and certainly to destroy the infrastructure that he's built.
Thank you, Graeme, for joining us today. We're out of time, but it's been a really fascinating discussion. And we have another panel right now, starting in, I think, a minute. So hopefully, we'll see you all there. And yeah, that's all. Thanks so much.